Hi everyone, my name is Nadler Lerner, and this is the very first episode of the Civil Discourse Project. The Civil Discourse Project is a video podcast aiming to promote civil, respectful conversations about hot-button contested issues between people with opposing views. This is not a formal debate or an outlet for anyone to attack their opposer. It is simply an exercise in civil discourse and discussion in an age where that is becoming more and more difficult and unpopular. Every episode will focus on a different topic, which will be discussed by the guests with opposing views on that topic. I will act as a moderator to ensure that the conversation stays on topic and respectful. This week's topic is very relevant for today and this week especially. It's about censorship. Censorship specifically of the President of the United States. Over the last week, Donald Trump has been banned and blocked from various social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even YouTube now. This is a move that is fairly unprecedented and largely contested and seen by conservatives as an attack on free speech and part of a larger effort to censor conservative voices at large. Namely, right now, the most well-known example of this is Parler being shut down and taken off of Apple and AWS services, effectively silencing anybody that has been on it. With that, I'd like to introduce today's guests. Presenting the conservative side of the issue is David Weiss. And presenting the liberal side of the issue is Benji Nadler. David, why don't we start with you? Can you just in one sentence tell us who you are and why you decided to take part in this project?
Okay, so thank you, Meira, for having me on. It's truly a pleasure. My name is David Weiss. I live here in Israel in Karnei Shomron. So the reason I wanted to join was because I feel like something has gone wrong in American and Israeli politics and the whole discourse. When I grew up, I remember when it came to politics, we felt that the other side was wrong, but they weren't the enemy. Now I feel like too often in politics, we view the other side as the enemy instead of just the political opposition. And I want to join this project to help correct that problem.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. Benji, how about you? Tell us who you are and why you decided to do this.
Hi, my name is Benji Nadler. I live here in Israel in Modi'in. Being I guess you could call it a student of the West Wing, I've always been sort of a political junkie. I enjoy the political arena. But yeah, I think that it's the idea of civil discourse has gotten far too politicized to the point where even standing up for facts, regardless of which side it's on, you're now defending that side, and I think that that's ridiculous. So, yeah, I'm excited to engage in a productive conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Benji. So thank you both for stepping up. We're going to get started. I just want to remind both of you that I will be calling out any out-of-line behavior that I see. If I feel that anybody is becoming too aggressive or disrespectful, I will raise my hand and hope that you will both take a step back. That also goes with going off topic. I will step in or raise my hand and try to bring you guys back in. And lastly, if I feel that anybody is talking for a very long time without giving the other person a chance to have their say, I will also raise my hand or step in to say something. With that said, I'd like to open the conversation with a question. We'll start with you, David, and then we'll take it from there. Why do you feel that Donald Trump being locked on social media is considered censorship or should be considered censorship? And why do you think that's a problem given the huge amount of controversy and anger and I wouldn't say incitement, but what people feel is incitement coming out of those channels? Why do you think that's a problem?
Sure. So there's two ways to approach this question. One is from sort of a legalistic perspective, and the other one is from a social perspective. From a legal perspective, what the social media platforms did is essentially fine. you're allowed to decide who you want to engage with. If you want to cut someone off, you can cut someone off. If you want to delete someone's account, they're legally allowed to. That's just the law. So I'm not really coming here from a legal perspective and saying, oh my gosh, how terrible. The bigger issue as I see it is actually a societal one. Do we want to live in a society in which people say, you know what, I disagree with what you say. I think what you're saying is false. I think what you're saying is harmful. So therefore, I am going to censor you. So that's the problem. If you look at it from sort of a historic perspective, the internet was, or I should say more specifically, social media was designed that people with all sorts of different perspectives can come on one platform and share their ideas. Somehow it's evolved into, well, let's try to cut out some bad stuff, to the point where I think it's gotten excessively political. And now they're downgrading content that they don't like. They're pushing content that they like with clearly political motives. So I think that's the problem we're getting at. It's less of a legal problem and much more of a social problem of how are we going to share a society if there's a feeling that one side is trying to shut down the other.
So on that note, I agree 100%. I don't disagree with a single thing that David just said. And I think that it's exactly right. I think that the problem arises not when people disagree on ideas, but when they disagree on facts. And that's really where it comes down to. And looking at, for example, what happened with the President of the United States is that he has, for weeks now, since the November 6th election, he has perpetuated a narrative that has been proven in courts of law to be false. And he claims that, the courts are against him, the judges are against him, the Supreme Court's against, everybody's against him. And he's being cheated out of an election. And that's been demonstrably proven false. And as a result of that, his language, which has constantly sort of towed the line between civil and incitement, or not civil, but borderline incitement, and I guess what you could now be considered at what would now be considered as incitement, after the January 6th protest. That's where it sort of jumped over the line, and I think that's where the social media platforms felt that they had to get involved, because it created a violent outburst. And I think that had that not happened, that none of this would have changed. It would have been, he would have sat there, complaining about the election, and ultimately nothing would have happened as a result of that protest. I think that they felt the need to step in.
Right. So actually, I have an interesting response to that, because it was something I was thinking about. I remember early on in the days of, I'd say post 9/11 America. If you remember, there was a 9/11 truth movement, which of course, like personally, I believe is complete garbage. I mean, some of the stuff there is totally off the deep end crazy. But it was allowed to be on the internet. And I don't recall there being this great movement of trying to, deplatform all these people. Because I remember actually the movie, I think it was called Loose Change. It went quite viral for the standards of whatever year it was made, like 2008, 2009. There were other documentaries before that. And my feeling is, how did the 9/11 conspiracy theories eventually just fall to the wayside? It wasn't because they tried to shut down all these theories. They weren't being deplatformed. But what really happened was, I think the year was 2006. I might be getting this a little bit off, but Popular Mechanics decided we're actually going to go through every single thing they said and just debunk it one at a time. And they did phenomenal work. I watched their documentaries. It was very, very well done. So the point I'm trying to get at is, if you think that the solution is we therefore have to just shut the president's mouth, we're going to take him off Facebook, take him off Twitter, take him off YouTube, and so on, you're actually making a martyr out of him. It's actually somewhat similar to what's happened to Holocaust deniers in Europe. By silencing them, you actually turn them into martyrs, which is not what our goal is. By debunking them and just making them look really, really stupid, eventually the vast majority of people, from what I've seen, say, yeah, that guy's pretty dumb. I'm not going to follow him.
Yeah, and I think that that's true. Again, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that the difference between, when you look at the birther movement, the truther movement, the 9/11 conspiracies, all of those different things did not have a violent outburst as a result of it, like we saw resulting from the protest. Whether or not you want to lay the blame at the feet of the president directly that he incited it and deserves to be impeached, that I think that that's debatable.
Right.
What isn't debatable is the result of perpetuating demonstrably inaccurate facts, and that, you know, he fed this false narrative to his base, to his base, to the point that, you know, they took action. Whether or not he's to blame, it was his words that seemingly, I mean, if you sort of just follow the path, it was his words that created that outburst. And as a result of that, I think that that's the major difference between the examples you're giving and what we have today.
Okay, so I guess we'll let Mira go on. I know she has other questions prepared, so go for it.
Yeah, so Benji, I want to bring this up just because it's something that's been a common thread that I'm seeing, certainly from conservative pundits and people that are more on that side of things. How do you respond to people who are saying, well, you're silencing Trump and you're not letting him have a platform on social media? Meanwhile, you have like the Ayatollahs in Iran who are free to tweet whatever they want, and they do absolutely call for, you know, death to Israel and America and you know, free Western values. How do you respond to that?
So again, I think that the way that the conservative pundits are framing the issue is one of, oh, woe is us, and I think that that's the wrong way to frame the conversation. If we're going to say that Trump and his rhetoric is akin to the Ayatollah, then I think that we can say that, you know what, it's a good thing that he was banned. Now let's do more. Again, I would go back to the idea of it's not the words itself and the language itself that is problematic, but the result of the words. Again, I don't think that any of this would have happened had there not been a violent riot as a result of the protest that he was at.
Okay, so about that, in terms of what I think you're doing is there's sort of like a logical flow. I think it's called playing the tape backwards, where you say, because there was a riot at the end, therefore we now have to shut him down. So what it means is that conceptually, what he said didn't cross the line. It only crossed the line because people who were not him decided to now act violently and you know, cause a whole balagan in the Capitol, and that was horrible. And because that was so terrible, we now have to censor Trump. So I don't quite like the logical thinking which would be, if they stayed outside the Capitol, then he would be totally fine. Now, in terms of what you said before, you're actually right. I'm a baseball umpire here in Israel. I did an umpire course. I haven't umpired that many games, but if there's one thing that we learned very early on in the course, once you establish, in this case, it's baseball, so the strike zone, that's the strike zone for the game. If you're going to call a certain pitch a little bit outside, you're going to call that strike, you're calling that the entire game. It must be fair for both teams. So the issue that a lot of the conservative pundits had was when the Ayatollahs, I actually looked this up beforehand, it was from Khamenei TV, May 24th. They published something which basically said, we're not anti-Semites, we only want to destroy Israel. So we're only kind of genocidal. And so the question is, like, okay, why is that call for genocide allowed, but yet Trump saying things which are false? I mean, he, at the end of the day, he had a chance to, you know, challenge the election in court. He failed. I mean, I can go on for a while. I don't want to get lost, but he had a bad team. There are election irregularities. There are mathematic things which would need to be explained, but he didn't do his job of actually proving that the election was stolen. He didn't. So the question is, why is it that saying a stolen election, saying that the election is stolen, we have to silence? But saying we want to destroy Israel is something we don't necessarily silence. I mean, for that matter, I mean, Stacey Abrams considers herself the governor of Georgia because it was a stolen election. I mean, I even found, actually, I found a Wikipedia page on the controversies of the 2004 election. And I remember as a kid watching on the news, people saying, all these irregularities and maybe Bush didn't really win and the election was stolen. It happens. People lose elections and they're sore losers. It's life. It happens in, I assume, every single country. But here it was treated like, oh my gosh, if you say the election was stolen, we have to shut you down. And that's a very big problem.
Again, I don't think it's an issue that the words that he was saying was that he was perpetuating a false narrative, because he's been doing that for years. Every time something happens that's bad for him, he says, "Oh, they're all against me." But the words that he used, and I printed out a quote from his speech, where he talks about, now it's up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. We're going to cheer our brave senators and congressmen and women. We're not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. I'm sorry, it's hard to read his speech because
it's always been an issue.
Yeah. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. And he goes on, and but
there's no incitement of violence there. That's the thing. What he's saying is legally wrong. Like, you don't just tell Congress, by the way, overturn the election. That's not how it works, but that's not incitement.
Correct. And I'm not saying that what he's doing is incitement. And I would go so far as to say that if, every time Ayatollah Khomeini, or even one time, he said, "Oh, let's go, march to the Capitol," and there was a bomb, then yeah, I think that they would probably take some action against him. And I hear what you're saying in terms of the logical fallacy, in terms of looking at the outcome, sort of Monday morning quarterbacking. But at the end of the day, he only has a limited amount of time left in office. And to a large degree, I think that he, to use your baseball analogy, he's been getting balls called where there should have been strikes for a long time because of his position. So now he doesn't have that clout. He's, he's a lame duck president. And I think that the social media outlets decided, you know what, this is an opportunity for us to, sort of make up for all of the balls that we've been calling previously. And whether or not that's fair, I think is a valid, conversation or argument to have. But I don't think anybody's saying Trump hasn't done anything that merits getting him banned. What they're saying is that, it's not right for you to ban him because he's the president.
Well, I think it's
Benji, I do actually, sorry, if I just interject with one thing here, only because you were quoting from Trump's speech, and I actually also did while I was waiting for my own appointment. I took some time to read through it myself. Just for the sake of being sure that we're representing things equally and fairly, a little bit farther down in that speech, he did say, Trump, that they should march peacefully and patriotically.
Yep, he does.
So what do you have to say to that? If the man is saying specifically to be peaceful and be respectful of, the military, and you can say either in that speech or in the tweet later, be respectful of the men in blue, do you feel that despite that it would still be considered a form of incitement, and that those words should still be considered part of what led to that riot, and that would still justify his being silenced?
I think the riot is basically the final straw of 4 years of basically towing and overstepping the line. I genuinely think that's what it is. Whether or not this particular speech or this particular incident or whatever it is was enough for the social media networks to say, you know what, this is too much, I don't know. But I genuinely think that he was handled with kid gloves because of his position. And I mean, look at how many times the leaders, the CEO of Facebook, Twitter, and Google have been called in front of Congress over the last 4 years versus the last 10 years. He had a level of clout, he had a level of power over them that he no longer has.
Right. So your point about, was Trump handled with kid gloves by social media? I disagree with it, because I disagree with the whole premise that it's their job to decide, well, this we're going to allow to keep up and this we're going to take down. The way I see it is, again, getting back to what I was saying initially with the civil society, is you really want to have as much free speech as possible and not have every sentence say, well, does that count? Are we keeping it up? Are we getting rid of it? When you get into that game, then it really turns into this feeling of, they're coming after us. And that's part of the problem. You don't want to have a situation where you feel like, as in the words of the conservative pundits, our tech overlords are determining what we can and can't say and what platforms we can be on, et cetera. You don't want that feeling. You want the feeling of, there's the debate publisher versus, was it publisher, not, what is the other term, not utility, publisher versus platform. You want these places to be felt like a platform. I just came here, I spoke my mind, and that's it. If it's if the social media companies feel like, well, we have to judge everything, then they're becoming publishers, and then they're getting into legally very dicey territory, because then they're really taking responsibility for everything that goes on their site. And then if another political leader somewhere else in the world starts inciting violence, now do they have legal liability because they now said we're acting like a publisher? So you have to be careful, I guess, with that type of argument, because if I were in the social media world, I'd say, guys, this can end really badly.
Yeah, and again, I think that that's fair, but it's not like they're making up the rules on the spot. They're enforcing the rules selectively,
Right,
but the
that's
rules
right.
exist. Yeah, there's no question they selectively enforce their terms of service. But the fact of the matter is that when you sign up to the platform, you sign up to their terms of service. So I think it's perfectly valid to say that, there are anti-Semites and there are, white supremacists and, 1,000 different, racist and hateful groups that utilize those platforms to speak hate. I don't think I don't think anybody can deny that. Those posts go against the terms of service. So again, going back to what I was saying before, I have a problem not with people being upset with the fact that Donald Trump was banned from social platforms. I have a problem with the way that the argument is framed, because again, like the
How do you see
the
it being framed?
comparison.
I want to make sure we're clear. How do you see it being framed?
So I have it, the way that I've seen it being framed is this should not have happened. And oh, look at this white supremacist and the Ayatollah and this guy and that guy and everybody else is saying all these terrible things, and they're not removed from the platform. So from my perspective, I say, okay, great. You're comparing Trump to the Ayatollah. I don't know that I would make that comparison, but there, you've made the comparison. So Trump deserves to be banned, and so does the Ayatollah. So now let's focus on creating a movement or um, um, some type of um, policy where it gets the terms of service get enforced across the board fairly for let's say people who have a larger soapbox. It's not the town square. You don't get to say whatever you want. You have to abide by their rules.
Right. So about the question of what should these rules be, here's sort of my general feeling. I haven't thought about it to every last detail, but if the social media platforms think that it's their obligation to take something down, it should not just be because I don't like it or because it is false or because it might be a little bit mean. Anything they take down should also be because it is illegal. So for example, if they think something is so terrible that has to be taken down, it should be something where they say, actually, this is a problem, and even contact law enforcement to say, I think this actually violates the law. If it's violating the laws of, in this case, the United States, then yes, you should be able to take it down. But it shouldn't just be, I think what he said is just false. He said he won the election, it's false, let's take it down. That's my feeling.
I mean, again, I hear what you're saying, but what you're talking about requires legislation.
Not
There's
quite,
no
because
other.
you can't like use social media as a way to break the law. For example, like if I want to incite violence, I can't say, well, I'm on social media, so therefore it's okay. No, if you actually said, let's all go and burn this guy's house down, that's illegal. You're inciting violence or inciting potentially mob violence, and go to the police. If that's what we're talking about, whatever it is, it shouldn't just be it's mean. It should be, okay, we're taking this down because this really, really crossed the line. This is illegal.
No, I understand, but what you're describing is the ability for an outside entity to rewrite these organizations' terms of service, which would require legislation.
Well, no, I'm saying it should be based on existing legislation. meaning they shouldn't be going into with the mentality of let's take down content, but saying we're going to basically leave stuff up. We'll allow people to get as messy as they want. But if it gets to the point where we think they're really breaking the law, then we're not just taking it down, but we're actually contacting the law enforcement and say, here, the law was broken. Look, that's my rule, meaning as much free speech until you get to the point where it actually breaks the law, like incitement to violence, like inciting a mob to riot, things like that.
But from that perspective, the genie's already out of the bottle. I mean, you have rules with regards to content, for graphic content, for video content, for copyrights, for a whole wide range of potential restrictions. And to go and say that now everyone's allowed to do whatever they want, so long as they're not inciting someone to break the law, they've already moved past that. So what I'm hearing from you is that the requirement to get, the requirement for these organizations is to move it back. And the only way to do that is through legislation, because otherwise you can't force a private corporation to enforce rules in any way. The government doesn't have that ability.
Okay. All right, so let Meira go on if she has other questions she prepared.
Yeah, so thanks, David. So I do just want to bring this back. I might be breaking my own rule a little bit and going slightly off topic, but I do think that it's relevant. David, I'll bring it to you. Another thing that people are saying, certainly from the conservative side, is that there are many other left liberal leaning politicians that over the summer and the BLM protests and riots, there were people like Kamala Harris, for example, the US president-elect at this point, who seemed to be encouraging the protests and riots, and even at some point was working to fundraise to raise money to bail some of those protesters out of jail who were arrested. Do you think, David, let's start with you, do you think that that is something that should be brought up in terms of social media censorship? And should it be applying to retroactively to those people as well? And if not, why do you think that there should be a difference?
Sure. So I'm going to stick with my principle, which is generally, let's not try to like crack down on social media. Let's not try to, throw people in jail. Let's not deplatform, things like that. That's generally my feeling. But you're right. For example, what happened with Kamala Harris and she had some sort of campaign to help bail some of the, I assume, rioters, because they ended up getting arrested, some of the rioters out of jail. Now, technically, that's legal. You're allowed to, post bail. That's part of the legal system. But so that itself, I don't know if it's an example of incitement, but there were other examples of incitement to violence. So for example, a number of years ago, I remember Congresswoman Maxine Waters was standing up in front of a crowd, and she specifically said, basically confront the Republicans, and wherever you see them, she specifically said, like in a gas station, at a restaurant, basically just harass them. And she was really, it was really a call to arms, and it actually happened. So it wasn't theoretical. I mean, there were, clip after clip of, Republicans who were sitting in restaurants and just out with their family or at home, and protesters were coming and, protesting outside of their house, etc. So my general feeling is, if you're going to start enforcing these standards, again, like the baseball umpire, you got to enforce them evenly. It cannot just be, okay, Trump did something bad, we have to enforce the rules with him. But then on the other side, we're going to pretend like absolutely nothing happened. And that's really the problem that we have. So if there were specific examples, like in the BLM protests, where there was incitement to violence, then yeah, that's the type of content that has to be taken down. And in this case, legal prosecution. It shouldn't just be taken down because I happen to not like it or I happen to disagree with the cause. That's not a reason.
So I think, I mean, it's hard for me to have to talk about the subject because I feel very strongly about this. And David knows this because he read my thoughts on it. I have a problem with creating parallels between what happened in January, what happened over the summer. I think that, first of all, certainly we know that people who were arrested were not all rioters. The police forces arrested people with pretty broad swashes. A lot of people were released. Some people needed to get bailed out, and just because they were in jail doesn't mean that they were rioting. The way that I think about what happened this month versus what happened over the summer is really more of a question of the motivation behind it. So in terms of the January protests that turned into a riot, they were protesting a false narrative. And in terms of what happened this summer, just very quickly while you were talking, I pulled up the sorry, the speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave addressing riots specifically. Dr. King, of course, was vehemently nonviolent. And he said, and I quote, "Now I want to say something about the fact that we have lived over these last 2 or 3 summers with agony, and we have seen our cities going up in flames. And I would be the first to say that I am not committed to militant, powerful, massive, that I am still, I apologize, that I am still committed to militant, powerful, massive, nonviolence as the most potent weapon in grappling with the problem from a direct action point of view. I'm absolutely convinced that a riot merely intensifies the fears of the white community while relieving their guilt. And I feel we must always work with an effective, powerful weapon and method that brings about tangible results. But it's not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention." And he goes on, and he's far more eloquent than I can be. But in essence, what he's saying is that, and this is a quote that's been perpetuated quite a bit over the last few months, riots are the voice of the unheard. And without getting into what I believe to be systemic issues within the United States, when it comes to law enforcement, there is a very large percent of the population that feels that they are treated differently from the rest of the population based off of their appearance. That's the issue that I have with making the comparison.
So my response to that would be, once political violence is sanctioned, you're in a lot of trouble. Okay, because once the cat's out of the bag, the cat is out of the bag. The problem, as I saw it coming from the left throughout the summer months, was that they basically were justifying the violence, downplaying the violence, sometimes saying it didn't even occur. Like, the most annoying thing I hear from people on the left is Antifa doesn't exist. And I know what they're saying. They're saying it doesn't exist as an organization, but to deny that there's rioting going on in the streets with people wearing, all black, and they have these, like rod, batons, and shields and smashing things to say they don't exist, it's gaslighting, right? So my problem is, I oppose political violence. That is a rule. I don't care if it's coming from my side. Like, I voted for Trump, but I oppose 100% the people who stormed the Capitol. I see them as a bunch of morons and they should be sent to jail. That's my feeling. And my opposition to, let's say, the Antifa or BLM rioting, it's not because I disagree with the narrative. It's not like, I don't think American police are systematically racist. I don't think America is a systematically racist country. Yes, there are individual racists. They're the scum of the earth. But I don't think as a society, America is racist. Yep. You want? Should I just finish this thought?
Finish the thought. I just think we're getting a little bit too far into the riots itself, and I did want to kind of keep this more to what should be censored and what shouldn't be.
Okay.
The thought,
As the bottom line is, if you sort of allow rioting and violence to happen on one side, just saying, well, I kind of agree with the cause, that's the problem. Violence is bad, regardless of who it comes from, whether I agree with it or not.
And of that, we could agree 100%. Violence is wrong. The point that I was trying to make wasn't a question of justification of violence, but a question of understanding motivation. That's all.
Okay, before we start wrapping up, only because I do think that it's still relevant for the conversation, but we are going a little bit over time. Just in 5 minutes, Benji, can you give me your thoughts on Parler, the whole situation with Parler and being taken off of Apple and AWS services, if you think that's something that is justified or not, and then David, you can give your response to that.
Sure. So the issue with AWS, I'm a little bit fuzzier on. I didn't see the specific reasoning why they pulled it off the AWS servers. My understanding, it was similar to some of the white supremacist sites that were pulled off of AWS, along with a number of other servers, because of the content itself. Parler itself isn't a platform that has any stance, but their lack of moderation was problematic to Google and Apple. That again, you want to talk about whether or not they're enforcing properly or fairly. That's a fair conversation to have, but they have rules in place with regards to moderation of content, and that's something that wasn't being enforced. So, again, if you're going to create a platform that violates the terms of service for the distributors of that platform, then it's problematic. They got a lot of attention thanks to Trump, and that community also hurt them.
So about what happened with Parler per se. So I heard an interview with Amy. I think her last name is pronounced Pykoff. She's the chief policy officer at Parler, and she explained what happened. And she said basically this past Friday at 12 noon in the afternoon Pacific time. She got an email from I think it was Amazon, or sorry, Apple. The first one she got was from Apple saying you have to clean up your website, and if not, we're removing it within 24 hours. Now, this right off the bat is bad faith. If you're telling anyone on a Friday afternoon, you have 24 hours to shape up your entire business or you're off the air, that's not acting in good faith. Within an hour, she got a similar one from Amazon. So were they colluding? Were they not? I don't know. It looks quite suspicious, but it definitely seems like they were acting in bad faith. And she said, actually, before this happened, she thought at first they were out of the water. Why? Because on Wednesday, she was contacted by Amazon saying, your app is being used to promote violence, but they didn't actually send her any specific examples. So she replied saying, can you give me some examples? Do you want to set up a meeting? The next day they replied saying, no, the issue is resolved. That was a Thursday. And then Friday comes and they basically, drop the bomb on them. So the issue with Parler is that, again, legally, Amazon, Google, Apple, they can just cut anyone off because there's no such thing in American law as political discrimination. You're allowed to discriminate based on politics. However, were they acting in good faith? Did they see this as sort of the alternative to Twitter because Twitter had been taken over as they saw it by the left? So Parler was meant to be the right-wing Twitter, and therefore these companies wanted to take it down. Who knows? But at the end of the day, that's definitely the look it gave off. And this gets back to what I was originally saying. If the goal is to create a civil society where we can all share space together, this is basically saying we're going to moderate you. We're going to downgrade your content. We're going to, deplatform you from our site. And when you create your own sites, we're going to knock them off the internet. So that's the problem, as I saw it.
I think that's fair. I don't know that I necessarily, disagree with anything you're saying on a factual basis. I think that I don't know that I can disagree with anything you're saying on a factual basis. I think that from a practical standpoint, the issue of Parler is much more a frustration at existing social media platforms than it is with what happened to Parler. Because the reality is that nobody's moving off of Facebook. Nobody's moving off of Twitter. At least not enough users for anyone at these organizations to take notice. So what are you going to do? You're not going to get people to delete their accounts en masse to the point where it's going to affect their bottom line. So you stomp your feet and you make us a stink about it. I think that's a lot more of why we're hearing about it, is because the reality is that society is pretty tied to our social media. You're not going to get people to delete their Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, whatever it is, en masse, just because of political disagreements or political opinions or whatever it is. I mean, the reality is that even I just totally lost my train of thought. Apologize. Um, when it comes to political discourse, you know, people do what they do. And if they're going to do it on a different platform, they're going to, you know, go create their own playing field. That's fine. But I really do think that a lot of the issue about Parler is just simply that you're not going to get people off of these social platforms. So, you know, here's an opportunity to again sort of kick the giants.
Right. So if you, in terms of questions, are you ever going to get people off Facebook? Are you ever going to get them off Twitter, et cetera? Like my gut feeling says no, but you know, the numbers of Parler did seem to indicate that they were getting more and more users. I mean, their numbers were growing exponentially around the time of the election. So I'm sure that there was someone at Facebook and Twitter and all these other companies that were saying, I don't know, this is kind of dicey. Like, I don't really want all of these people jumping there, because what's going to end up happening is they'd say, okay, I'll go to Facebook if I want to get friends, pictures, my left wing feed. And then if I want to get the right wing feed, I'm going to go over to Parler. Now, at some point, do you hit the point where more and more people migrate over where it is considered to be a threat? I don't know. My gut feeling says no, but I have to say it's possible. About the Parler and moderating, so one of the things that the chief policy officer was saying is that they had a very, very lax moderation policy. Their goal was not, you know, to create some algorithm that's just going to knock off all sorts of content without a human ever looking at it. You could report it. It was reviewed by what they like to call a jury. But I think the Amazons and the Apples of the world wanted them to create algorithms that would just start knocking things off, which went against their philosophy. So that was, you know, part of the disagreement that I think they had between the different companies.
Yeah, and again, I think that when it comes to sort of the exponential growth that Parler has seen, I find it hard to believe that any of these organizations gave it much credence, because exponential growth from the hundreds, you're still talking in the thousands. These platforms are in the billions. If you're not talking about something in the millions, then I don't know how concerned they are. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to look up the numbers as we speak on Parler. I saw something, I don't know if it was official, but they went from, I don't remember if the number was like 4 million to 12 million in the span of a matter of weeks. I could be totally wrong with the numbers, but the point was
Okay.
they definitely saw significant growth. I mean, I was on Parler. I could tell you it was not a well-designed app. It was like nearly impossible to find people. So I didn't particularly enjoy using. I tried it for like one day and then just forgot I even had the account until it was knocked off. But regardless, you know, there clearly were people who were using it. Like if you looked up, you know, the famous people, you'd see, you know, tens of thousands of interactions. So it wasn't like no one was using it at all. But yeah, they needed to do a lot of work just on cleaning up their app in order to really compete. I never felt when I downloaded it that it was, you know, really going to take over.
Right, and it's also like the question that, you know, these social platforms would have to ask themselves is, you know, okay, so they went from, let's say the numbers are right, 4 million to 12 million. Okay, so we have I don't know, I think Zuckerberg said they have something like 15 billion or 100 billion logins per day. Or
They just interrupt you quickly. I've actually found the numbers from Wikipedia. As of January 2021, according to Parler, the service had about 15 million total users. As of December 2020, they had 2.3 million active users. Now, I don't know, active users, total users, whatever, but the point was they clearly were growing and there was something
Sure.
there. Anyway, continue.
So the question that they would have to ask themselves before they took action that would potentially have ramifications against them, including antitrust, because there could absolutely be antitrust lawsuits through Congress brought against them, was whether or not this is a flash in the pan. I mean, I have a hard time believing that these companies would have A, gotten together and made a joint decision, and B, risked that much over what was at the time 15 million, and they didn't know whether or not that growth was sustainable. I just don't know.
Who knows? Yeah.
All right, so I think we want to start wrapping this up. But before we do, I'd really like to ask each of you, just to close things out, did you find this conversation to be productive? Did you find that you had some common grounds with each other? And do you think that there's a way forward, certainly with this particular issue, and just in terms of people on opposite sides being able to come together and rationally discuss that? Dave, go out and start with you.
So yeah, I absolutely enjoyed the time we spent discussing it. I think the main thing we achieved was realizing that, you know, people of reasonable opinion can come together and discuss topics with each other. You know, you're not evil, I'm not evil. We're not all trying to just destroy each other. And that's really the key. As long as we can sit down around a metaphorical table, because we're all kind of far apart, as long as we could sit around that table and just have a discussion and really just see eye to eye with the other person. Yeah, I see where you're coming from, and you know, there's a certain logic to it. I disagree, you know, I disagree on terms of policy, but that's fine as long as we can all, you know, get around this table and say, okay, there are reasonable people on the other side. That allows you to start bridging the gap and, you know, come to some sort of a compromise.
Yeah, I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think that the narrative that's been pushed for years, even before the divide got big. I mean, one of the top shows on CNN used to be Crossfire, and you know, you have this narrative that's been perpetuated for forget years, decades, that you know, the left and the right are going to argue, and you know, it's we have to fight, and it's become this, you know, it's not a question of policy, it's a question of winning. So yeah, I love the idea of just sitting down and having a civil conversation where, you know, you can exchange ideas, you don't have to agree, but ultimately, you know, you humanize someone who you disagree with, who through the media, regardless of which outlet you're looking at, generally demonizes.
Thank you guys so much for doing this and for stepping up. I know it's not an easy thing to do in this political climate, certainly. It's not something that you don't always agree with and have an interesting and intelligent conversation about a tough issue. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. And I hope that we can continue these kinds of conversations in the future. So thank you. I'm going to continue on my own, but you guys are welcome to sign out at this point.
Great, thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Well, that really brings our first episode of the Civil Discourse Project to a close. Before I officially sign out, I do want to take some time to express my own views. First of all, just to express how I feel like that conversation went. I think it was really productive. I think that both David and Benji brought up a lot of really good points. Benji certainly brought up some points that I hadn't thought about on my own as a conservative myself. I think that his point to the comparison that a lot of people on the right make between, you know, saying, well, if you're going to ban Donald Trump on social media, why don't you ban, you know, the Ayatollahs in Iran and white supremacists who are really actively calling out for violence. That what Benji was saying about, well, I don't want to make that comparison, but if you do, then yeah, maybe he should be banned and they should be banned as well. I also think, not that I necessarily agree with anybody being banned, but it's an interesting point to think about when people on the right make that argument or try to make that argument. I also think that there's really something to think about in terms of whether or not this should be brought up to legislation, whether there should be legislature in favor of more censoring, even of world leaders, if they're putting out content that in theory could incite violence, or if there should be legislation specifically against that. We're seeing a lot of these social media platforms who, as of now, legally speaking, they can do whatever they want. And anybody that believes in a free market, I think would agree that you want to maintain that. But it's a slippery slope. Once you start silencing world leaders, and for better or worse, those who disagree or not, Donald Trump is a world leader at this point. You're really heading down what could potentially be a really dangerous path. I don't think that the goal at the end of the day transparency. When you silence people who have a world stage, and even not, when you silence people that have different views, you shut down the opportunity for discussion, for debate, for an exchange of views, and the opportunity to find common ground. And I think that really should be the ultimate goal of things, not to silence, but to bring those conversations forward. Even in cases where there is a call for violence, and I don't know that I agree that Trump did call for that. I think it's pretty clear that he did not, even if his general speech and attitude might have led to that. I think that it's important for people to be able to see that and those conversations happening and have the opportunity to stand up and say, no, this is wrong, or no, this is why it isn't wrong. We can only really move forward with free and transparent and open and honest conversations. On that note, I do think that this particular conversation is really enlightening and really well, and everybody maintains civility and a level of respect. And I think that all parties in this conversation are going to walk away feeling like they did learn something and that they do see a way forward and being able to find common ground with those that they disagree with. So on that note, thank you all for tuning in and being part of promoting civil discourse. It's not always easy to do, but ultimately we need to find a way to understand and respect each other, even when we don't agree. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more like it, or if you'd like to take part in the project, please follow the Civil Discourse Project on Facebook,